Hey, good evening, everybody. I am Rick Wilson, and this is the strategy session from Resolute Square. I'll be your host tonight, driving the train. With me, as always, are Joe Trippi and Stu Stevens, and, of course, friend of the show, longtime political strategist, amazing commentator, founder of the incredible Hopium Chronicles on Substack. And if you don't already know Simon Rosenberg, you are about to know Simon Rosenberg, because he is a guy who has had his finger on the pulse of this election. Even in the darkest hours, Simon was saying one thing over and over: we got this. We can do this. There's a way. And now I think there's much more of a way than there was the last time we had you on the show, Simon. We were joking about this before we came on the air. The last time we were in the midst of a very, very dark period for Joe Biden. Talk to us about what the political landscape looks like today versus then.
Well, it's so vastly changed. And I think all of us all of us here have been doing this a long time. And the events of the last few months, if you would put that in a script to the West Wing, it would have been rejected, I think, as being too outlandish and too wild, right?
A lot of cocaine, but yes.
Yeah, right. I mean, if you just think about the sequence, right? Biden's was recovering and his gaining in the polls, his Trump's debate struggles that night, which I don't think has gotten nearly enough attention, and I think is now showing up. We talked about it, I think, last time I was on. And then the passing of the baton to Kamala, and then Kamala roaring out with incredible strength and power in an unexpected way. She was clearly ready for this historic moment. And then her pick of the VP, and here we are. I mean, the race has shifted 6 points, from where things were. When Biden was still in the race. We are now up in most of the battleground states. We're even tied in North Carolina and Georgia. And I think we're favored to win at this point. I mean, because not only do we have momentum and are we leading in the polls and the map is more favorable to us, but the money, the influx and the surge of money and volunteers has just made the entire Democratic machine much stronger. And we're going to be able to close in a far more powerful way than they will be able to. And Trump, and obviously on the other side, Trump is unfit and deeply unwell and has disappeared from the trail, and we're in the midst of one of the weirdest presidential campaigns in American history. And I think we're going to kick their ass.
I want to start with Stu and then jump to Joe on questions. Stuart, to begin at the end of what Simon just said, the idea that a presidential candidate would spend 3 days, maybe 4 days a week playing golf, would spend 2.5 hours on a chat telling rambling war stories with Captain Ketamine, Elon Musk. This is really a different approach to this world, isn't it? This is not normal.
When Newt Gingrich ran in 2012 for the primary, we described it as a book tour that became a presidential campaign. This seems to be some kind of mental breakdown that is a presidential campaign, that is playing itself out on the stage of a presidential campaign. This has been, I think, a characteristic of the Trump era, where these weird people come in and they use public life, public policy, government as therapy. I mean, the Stephen Millers, these are incredibly damaged people who somehow think that they can work through their problems. And I think, ask yourself, you're inside that campaign, you know what you're supposed to do. You just can't get your guy to do it. And, I think that there's dissertations going to be written about the prepared text of the acceptance speech and what he gave. Because, it's just right there. They knew what he needed to say. They're not idiots, but he can't say it for 10 minutes. Right. So I have some questions for Simon, but let's go to.
Let me get to Joe, and then Stuart, back to you for a question for Simon. But Joe, go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I was going to say, look, back before all this, Simon, all of us used to talk about Trump having a ceiling that we all thought was in the 45, 46% kind of range. We all knew that the polling showed that, like 53% of independents had come to believe that Trump was a grave threat to democracy. That a majority of voters said yes to that question. So it looked like, basically it was this 46-46 floating around thing with the folks that didn't want Trump at like in the 50s, 53, 50. And the problem was double haters. Biden's too old. And we were worried about, would the third parties take some of those people? I mean, could Biden get above him enough to win this thing? But it was always sort of a 46, 53, 47, 53 kind of race. And the second that he passed the torch and Kamala seized it with Walz, it's clear to me. And that's what I'm asking Simon. Like, in a lot of ways, that hasn't changed. I mean, that margin hasn't changed. Although I do think and this is what I want to ask you: do you think that Trump's ceiling may be actually drifting a little lower, and we can get up to that 50? You used to be out there screaming to high heavens, we got to get to 55. Everybody do the work, no matter how good it looks, no matter how much we're going to win, get to 55. Let's really take it to them. Do you see that now? I mean, I know it's a little early still, but what's your view of that?
I think we're going to know a lot more about this after the convention, but I do think, look, the basic story that I've been telling over the last 2 years is that I think the election we're in really emerged in the spring of 2022, and we've been in sort of one election, which is that in the spring of 2022, when Dobbs happened, it was just a bridge too far for a lot of people. And the Republican Party, which had already been seen as dangerous and extreme, was sort of cemented as this threat to our democracy. And what always had to happen in the spring of 2022 was, what would be that thing that kicked it off and made it really clear that they were choosing this sort of extremist direction that the country had voted against in 2018 and 2020? And it was Dobbs, and it was Uvalde, and it was the January 6th committee hearing. It was a series of things that I think congealed into creating this environment where, in this time, I think what happened is you had I think what was critical in tipping this was the pick of J.D. Vance. And I think that Vance became a confirmation that Trump was choosing a truly extremist direction. There was no olive branch to the wavering Republicans and to independents or to anybody who used to be a former Republican. Nikki Haley was disinvited from the convention and then, hurriedly sort of invited at the end. And I think Trump made a catastrophic error that was on the sort of the scale of what Dobbs was in 2022, is this vivid reminder that radicalized people all across the country against what is really the worst VP pick in modern times, and just a truly bad person, right? I mean, Vance is just an odious guy in addition to being an incredible extremist. And so I think that what they offered us in a time when the country had been voting against MAGA again and again and again, they gave us MAGA on steroids, super MAGA, right? And what do you think was going to happen at that point? So to your point, Joe, is it possible that they've lowered the ceiling because of their escalating extremists, because they nominated a rapist, fraudster, traitor, and a felon, and because they've shoved all this stuff in our face in this kind of ugly way? Yeah, of course it's possible that they've lowered their ceiling because of it. And that's why I think what's so interesting about what's happening now is that Harris is just sailing. And I feel, I'm being very cautious. I don't want to jump ahead because the ground is still so uncertain under our feet. But we have to be deeply optimistic about not just winning this election, but if we work really hard, winning in a way that makes it a clear repudiation of this awful politics.
So I wanted to ask Joe a question. Joe, you've been around the Democratic Party for a long time. I'm having trouble remembering a moment since Barack Obama where the party came together, its various multitude of factions. And my God, Stuart, I used to think like, well, my God, the Republican Party has three factions, the social conservatives, the foreign policy guys, the economic guys, and you guys have a billion. But they seem to have almost all come together with remarkable unity and remarkable speed behind Harris.
No, not just that. I think the other thing that's happening is you're seeing the emergence of a whole new generation of Democratic leaders. I mean, Shapiro, all the people that we talked about for potential vice presidential candidates. And by the way, everybody, when she picked Walz, I mean, it's not like those guys are going to disappear. Shapiro's going to be campaigning his heart out in Pennsylvania. Kelly will be campaigning his heart out in Arizona, Cooper in North Carolina. I mean, it's just so I think the party gets the stakes, always has. We could argue whether it would have consolidated eventually around Biden. We all hoped that it would over time as we got closer to November, but it clearly has, without a doubt, around Kamala. And if you think about that, back then when we were in a dead heat with Trump, and Joe Biden was getting 70% of blacks, not in the 90s, getting
Right.
much lower Latino numbers than Kamala was getting much worse numbers with young people. We were in a dead heat right then. So if once this happened with Kamala, it's, if that ever happened, if they ever went back towards big, normal numbers that a Democrat could pull together, if it consolidated, we'd have a leg up over Trump. That's happened. Now the question is I agree with Simon, with J.D. Vance, with the doubling down on, Super MAGA and Project 2025 and all that, although they try to run away from it, it won't work. But did they actually now help expand it even a little bit further with Walz being able to communicate with a lot of rural Americans, people who, are going to see this ice fishing hunter who did serve his country, all that. And I just don't think the villainization of him isn't going to work at all. But we'll see. It's early days still.
I want to talk to Simon, ask you, I know that we've had an expansion of the swing states. We're seeing it even in the more conservative reporting in the polling. Cook Political has moved Nevada, North Carolina, and Georgia out of lean Republican to toss up. Where are the states that you're keeping an eye on right now that you think are particularly hot for Harris? I'm keeping an eye on Georgia because, A, she's an African-American woman. We saw what happened when you had Reverend Warnock on the ticket to turn up African-American turnout. And Trump has been at war with the rest of the Republican establishment in the state. So, but I'm curious what other states you're following right now.
Yeah. I think there are two things. One is I do think what Joe said about Walz is going to be very interesting to see how he campaigns in the fall and whether he starts spending time in places that are hard for Democrats to traditionally go, these sort of rural and ex-urban communities. Does he go out and do the first day of hunting in North Carolina and so on? And what does he create a little bit of a permission structure in addition to all the work that all of you, the former Republicans, are doing, and assuming that Liz Cheney and others, endorse and get on board? He becomes this really interesting X factor in all of these states about whether he can get us another point or two, right, out of sort of older white guys that may be drifting away from the Republicans or have concerns about Trump. And I think that's one thing that I think is really interesting. And I think it's sort of the genius of what Harris did is that she has an ambassador now to parts of the country that were always going to be difficult for her to reach. And what she's saying to them is not only do I want you to be part of my campaign, but I'm going to be your president too. And this is really important, I think, and will matter more over time. The second, though, is in addition to Georgia, I'm very focused on Arizona and North Carolina, because in both states, you have these extremists at the top of the ticket, Kari Lake and Mark Robinson. You're starting to see Robinson starting to collapse in North Carolina. There were 3 polls this week showing Harris and Trump tied, or even one has Harris ahead by a point. And in all of them, Josh Stein is up by 7, 8, 9 points. And I don't know how they possibly win an election under those circumstances where the top of the ticket is starting to crater. I think something very similar is going to happen in Arizona with Kari Lake. And I tweeted out the other day that it's possible that Kari Lake and Mark Robinson make Kamala Harris the president. And so I think those 2 states are going to be really interesting to watch. I can tell you, I've been in North Carolina. I've worked closely with Anderson Clayton, the party chair there. I was at the state the dinner they had a few weeks ago. That state, Democrats feel it. They feel like they've got this opportunity. They're working their asses off, and they are really organized. And I feel very good about both of those states, in addition to all the other states that you mentioned.
And, Biden only lost North Carolina by 74,000 votes in 2020. Yeah. So it wasn't a big win for Trump by any means.
And you've got Trump going back into Asheville this week, which is a selection of a venue I find as a Western North Carolina expert, not only from I'm going to say, God, I'm embarrassed, summering there, but being around that my whole Western North Carolina, my whole life growing up. That is not friendly territory going to Asheville. He's going to attract some of these people, but the counties out there are very low population density relative to Charlotte, like Mecklenburg and other like more urban and suburban counties. I think Trump's nervous about North Carolina, and I think Robinson. I think you're right. I think Robinson could deliver that state for us, and do damage all the way down the ballot into the state legislative races as well.
Yeah, I think he's going to Asheville because he wants to stay at the Grove Inn.
Which, who doesn't want to stay at the Grove Park Inn?
Completely if that's the case, I think more of Trump. Simon, let me ask you a question. There's sort of a thread. I heard Nate Cohen saying today that Harris is, for the moment, sort of performing like a generic Democrat, that people are doing it. But when I look up the generic Democrat Republicans, it's tied at 45, and she seems to be doing better than a generic Democrat. And it seems to me that she's bringing what a generic Democrat would bring, I guess, but more because of her definition.
I think that I heard
worlds. Is she undefined enough that she's just getting a generic Democrat, or is she defined as something special, different?
I heard Nate. I caught that part of the interview today as I was in a car, and I thought that was really unfair, actually, in terms of and sort of made her small rather than making her big. I mean, any attempt to sort of minimize the magic and power and extraordinary things that we've all just witnessed with our own eyes over the last few weeks, I think is deeply dishonest. And Kamala Harris has had some of the best weeks in a presidential campaign in probably the history of the United States, in terms of just her performance, the crowds, the intensity, and everything else. So I do think that she has created a whole new dynamic. And building on what Joe said earlier, I think she did a few things. I don't think she's a generic Democrat. I think she made a very powerful connection to young people in the United States. I think she's tapping into the thing that I think the Trump campaign really feared about her, which is the anger and the anger that women have about what's happened with post-Dobbs and reproductive freedom and the sort of outrageous misogyny of the Trump era. And I think that she's also bringing, this power of a Western Democrat and the modernity of California, and just also that she's just new and unique and interesting and compelling, right? I mean, she's an incredibly compelling public figure. You guys know this. Her language and her stump came out of the box unbelievably strong, right? I was kind of shocked.
Crazy good.
Like So I think Nate is, doing what Nate's been doing a lot, which is, and what the media has been doing, is underselling our strengths and overselling theirs.
So guys, let me just ask one question here quick. Why is it that 2 months ago people were saying one of the biggest drags on the ticket for Biden was Harris? That people didn't want to vote for Joe Biden because they thought he might not make it through the 4 years, and you get Harris. How did that happen? And then this happened?
So I think it's one of I'm going to do real quick, and then I'll turn it over to you guys. Look, I will tell you that part of during this troubled period, I was the troubled period. We started getting real data on Harris, right? And I don't know, there just wasn't a lot of data about her. And the data that we had was also unfocused. Like, who cared about your opinion about her 3 months ago? And I think there was this impression in the family that she would be a weak candidate. And during the troubled period, we started getting data where she continually outperformed Biden. I wrote about this on Hopium all the time. Like, hey, for those of us, paying attention, if there is a change, I think we should be encouraged by the polling we're seeing. And I can tell you that I had significant conversations internally inside Biden-Harris world, reviewing this data, showing that, look, if we do make the change, this may actually benefit us. I mean, so I don't know how. I think this was something that was like an urban legend, Stuart, and sort of something that was based perhaps on her early days as VP, where I think she was a little bit not sure-footed, but she found herself, like many politicians that succeed, they grow in the job. They get bigger. They get stronger. She learned a lot. She has been campaigning her butt off for the last year. And what the Kamala that came out of the box, right, was ready, strong, powerful, seized the moment, and this remarkable politician that was so well regarded in California, not an easy state, by the way, to come out on top. And so, however we got here, it's an amazing moment, and it is as we've all been saying, a joyful one.
So one of the things I think that's happened, one of the things I think happened though is that that none of us saw. I certainly didn't. Was it? Trump had dominated the popular conversation. I mean, from the moment he came down that escalator, he dominated it. Whether you hated him, loved it, whatever, didn't matter. He culturally, the conversation that was happening in this country revolved around him constantly the entire time. And by the way, it was easy for him to maintain that against Joe Biden, 81 years old. With the, you're 78, he's 81, but you can make that, you can still dominate that conversation. What happened was when the second Kamala Harris got that baton, she's dominated that popular, the cultural shock that happened. I mean, understanding what brat means. I mean, totally not having to deal with, 78-year-old Trump can't compete with her ability to communicate across. She can communicate above her age and below it, big time. And that connection, I think, is what's really fueling this. It's not just like a lot of times the issues didn't matter. Whatever Trump was, it was his dominance.
Right.
He's become subordinated to her dominance of the conversation. And I think that's really important in driving through the next, 80-something days.
If I can just add one quick thing to that, I also think that her embrace of the frame of forward and backward, which is very apolitical, right? It's very inclusive. I mean, you can come with me. We're not going back. That also, she just nailed that, right? Like the baseline of the election around this very apolitical forward backward, which also worked very well for Obama, by the way. I think was also a critical moment in establishing what Joe said, is that she didn't define herself on left-right terms. She defined herself in this other dimension, which is forward and backward, and it worked, and she pulled it off. And I think it's also been an essential part of why this has been so exciting and interesting and different, because we're sort of getting out of these older boxes, right, that felt tired and worn. And we're now in just a new place. And this new place is exciting and interesting and compelling. And she's smiling and she's wearing really cool clothes and the rallies are fun. And this just feels like the modern world. We're back in the modern world. And so I also want to give her enormous credit, by the way, for having, to your point, Rick, you said it earlier, her narrative and story is just compelling, and it's hers. She's not wearing anyone else's clothes. It's who she is. She re-embraced the prosecutor part of her, which was essential to her identity in California. It's the Kamala that I knew 20 years ago. And so she's just being her. And she is loud and proud about being herself. And, I think that strength and confidence is also, and her willingness, the other thing she did when she came out of the box by talking about Trump immediately as a guy that she knew, and she put guys like him in jail. She looked at him and said, I'm your equal. I'm not going to let you push me around. I'm going to push you around. Yeah. And that toughness was also, I think, essential for her, for people evaluating her. Okay, she's got it. Like, she can take this bastard on,
Simon, that's a really important point. I think that people are still a little bit, they still haven't quite gotten on pace with it, is that Donald Trump has tried the things that used to work for him against her, the trolling, the nicknames, all those things. And instead of responding like, how outrageous of you, we're so angry, we're outraged, she's laughing at him. She's mocking him. She's like, okay, weirdo. And I think that is something where, to quote a famous Republican conservative leader back in the day, Andrew Breitbart said, the thing Republicans always got wrong was that politics was downstream of culture. They've missed that again. They thought Trump was the culture. They're wrong. She's much more in touch with the culture, much more in touch with with a spectrum of people across from Gen X on down into Gen A. And I think that is something that we really will look at this campaign on the back end and go, she got it. She understood the country better than Trump. I mean, and I've joked about this 100 times now, but I will take Charlie XCX and Megan Thee Stallion and Taylor Swift over Kid Rock and Hulk Hogan and weirdo 90s and 80s wrestlers any day of the week.
You know, I thought just on this Georgia thing, one little data point that really struck me. I saw where Trump had placed like a $41 million buy. 27 million of that was in Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
So how much money do you have to spend to take back what you said about the governor, which you did? It's like 27 million unforced error. And it's not going to work. I mean, that 27 million isn't going to undo anything you said about Brian Kemp or Brian Kemp's wife. How do you get in the fight with the popular governor? And really what's amazing, how do you get in the fight with the popular governor's wife? I mean, that's just like, whoa. But man, that is a lot of money to be throwing at a state that they thought they had in the bag, you know, a few weeks ago.
But can I say it gets back to something Rick said earlier, which is, I think we all knew after that first debate, you know, when that week after that debate, let's just say they felt like they were going to win this election right after that, he disappeared from the trail, right? He only did one event.
He got lazy.
Well, I also think that the campaign freaked out at his performance. And I think that, to your point about the scripting at the convention, I think they had a plan and he didn't follow it. He was, you know, can I say it? He was batshit crazy on air at that debate, which got completely obscured by Biden's struggles. But I was flabbergasted at how crazy Trump was at the debate. And I think there was evidence that the campaign was also flabbergasted and realized that, man, they had a lump of coal they were going to be selling here for the rest of the way. And then the campaign wanted anybody but J.D. Vance, and he picked J.D. Vance, and the campaign immediately leaked that was not their pick, right? He's continually going off script and sabotaging and submarining these efforts because he is diminished, because he is crazy, because he's lost his way. He's not in touch with reality anymore. And he's like, and so every time he goes out and speaks, like what happened in Georgia, I mean, that stuff, he didn't just attack the sitting governor of Georgia once, he did it a second time, right? And so he is just a wrecking ball for their campaign. And I think they're trying to keep him off the trail. I think he's okay with that. But I mean, even last night, every time he speaks in public, he does incredible damage to himself and the entire Republican ticket. And they're sitting on a really huge mess right now.
Oh, yeah.
How do you think this is going to affect these Republican tight races? Are they going to try to distance themselves from Trump? How do you see them trying to navigate?
I mean, look, the Senate races, you know, even 2 weeks ago, if you looked at the Senate polling, and we don't have as much state-based polling, in many of these races, we were up outside of margin of error already, right? The Republicans were already, like 2022, dramatically underperforming because they're very MAGA candidates that Trump endorsed, and these same states had rejected many of these exact same kind of candidates. Some of them are the exact same candidates themselves, again, McCormick and Kerry Lake, right? And I think that the real question is what happens in Montana, because it looks like Sherrod is holding in Ohio, and the NRSC just pulled some of their ads. And it may be that they may just be recalibrating. Like, we can't read too much into that, right? But, you know, Sherrod is consistently up by 4, 5, 6, 7 points. And Moreno is one of those bad candidates, right? The crazy MAGA guys. The Montana race becomes really important, right? Because I think that's going to probably, Ruben Gallego's in strong shape in Arizona. All of our candidates are polling very, very well. I think Montana becomes the big question. And then it does somehow either the Texas or Florida race, you know, get close. And I'm still skeptical about it, but I think we have to be open-minded that if the map is, if this thing is tilting, then, you know, those states, Biden didn't lose those states by very much in 2020. They're not as far gone as is the perception, I think. And we have compelling candidates there. I think Texas, I'm most interested to see what Harris does in Texas, right? Mm-hmm. You've got so many immigrants. She's a child of immigrants, such a huge African-American population. I think Texas becomes this real, and particularly with Cruz, who is the original odious, horrible, senator now being challenged by Vance as the new, more odious senator. I think keep an eye on Texas, because I think that we've never had a candidate. Texas's demography has changed substantially since when Obama's president, and I think it's just something we got to keep an eye on.
Well, I'll tell you one thing.
I will, as the Florida man on the call, I will say this, and I'm going to keep telling people this: Florida is not in play. It is not in play. But you can see in the far distance maybe a glimmer on the horizon where Florida has at least panicked the Trump people into spending money here, which is the bonfire of cash in any campaign in this country, in a state. If you want to spend money like it's going out of style, Florida's your huckleberry. We are seeing right now that Harris is up 15 points in Miami-Dade. That is a real number. I spoke to a senior party official here today who said that Orange County is showing similar numbers now. That should be the lights are flashing red for Trump. There's a million voter registration advantage in Florida out of the pool of 19 million voters or so. But I will tell you, folks, the Republicans, they have two things on the ballot that they are very scared of. One is the Choice Amendment. The other is the recreational marijuana amendment. Rick Scott is, for a guy who's run for statewide office and spent probably $400 million of his stolen fortune in the last 15 years, 20 years, he's still sort of bumping along with iffy numbers. If the Republicans start panicking here and Trump has to spend money in Florida, that's the ball game. He will be broke in a month, and that will be it.
Yeah, I mean,
well, I think two things. One is that if the Harris Walz can keep it close in Florida, I mean, I'm talking, just keep it within range. There is a chance that McChrystal-Powell could win that.
She's a terrific candidate. She's terrific.
And the second thing is, look, I just looking at some polling stuff that I've seen since all this happened in tough House races. There's a weird ticket splitting thing that I think it could happen here, where we're starting to see people who are voting for Trump actually thinking that they want a guardrail in the House or the Senate. I mean, it's bizarre what I'm looking at, but I actually think I don't think there's going to be much ticket splitting in this race. Trust me. But there's something weird going on where, particularly after the immunity ruling from the Supreme Court, there is how do I cover? I'm going to vote for him because I can't, but how I'm going to cover my bet. And it's a very weird thing, but I'm just starting to pick it up. I'm going to be anxious to see whether that continues.
Well, I'll tell you guys, one prediction I'll make is if Texas goes Democrat, you are going to see a rush for Republicans to abolish the Electoral College because they will never win again.
They'll never win again if Texas
cannot get there.
Well,
you just can't do the math.
This gets to
Texas.
Simon's. We got to keep everybody. You got to keep doing the work, no matter what this thing looks like, no matter how good it is. We keep doing the work. They keep doing the crazy. We keep doing the work and run it up everywhere we can and fight everywhere, including Texas and Florida.
If I can just say one last point on that, Rick, and then I'll let you guys close, is that I think that everyone's got to realize what Joe just said is so important, is that right now, the people that I'm talking to who are canvassing and making phone calls, so it's exciting. People are interested, right? You got this new candidate, new dynamic. And imagine if you're a marginal voter and you kind of have this new excitement, and then the campaign calls you, or the campaign knocks on your door. And it's like, not only is this exciting, but like they care about me. And what we're hearing anecdotally from people who are making calls and canvassing and texting right now is the reception has been unbelievable. And people are like, thank you for calling me. I want to people are volunteering to volunteer. They're not even having to be asked, right? And so I think there's this other dynamic right now that this huge grassroots army that is already deployed, it's not going to just be deployed in the early vote, it's already being deployed, is also moving the needle. It's turning people from potential voters, marginal voters, to our supporters. And then that is creating what I call this virtuous cycle of participation. This virtuous cycle is now beginning to kick in the election. And I think that everyone who is thinking about working, make your plan now. how you're going to close. Early vote starts in 38 days.
Yeah.
What are you going to do? But don't wait. Be active now. It's an amazing time to be talking to voters right now. The response has been incredible. And early vote starts in 38 days. Have your plan for how you're going to give, how you're going to volunteer, and also how you're going to vote on day one. It's important that everyone vote as early as they can in the early vote, because if you do that, our campaigns move on to lower propensity voters. It increases voter turnout. It helps us win. So voting on day one is also an important part of what all of you can do to make sure that we win in November.
Well, folks, I want to just thank Simon Rosenberg, Stu Stevens, and Joe Trippi once again for a fascinating conversation. Guys, we will be back again next Tuesday. This is going to get loud and hot and noisy, and there will be good days and there will be bad days. But I can say this unequivocally. We're going to win this. Get out there, do the work. We're going to win this. Folks, quick promos here at the end. Listen to The Trippi Show. Listen to Decoding Fox News, the Lincoln Project podcast, my podcast, The Enemies List, the Strategy Session. Get your gear at the merch store here at Resolute Square. Sign up. Get your friends to sign up. You can really help us grow. Tonight was one of our biggest nights online for the strategy session, and all of you made that happen. If you'll like and subscribe and share this content with your friends, we will get bigger and get this pro-democracy message out to the people that need to hear it.
And check everybody, out everybody listening should immediately stop after this and subscribe to Hopium.
Yes,
absolutely.
Simon's Substack is A+.
I will confess, it is the first thing I read when it comes. It's the only thing I read immediately when it comes in, and always feel like I learned something from it. So
I have one more thing before we sign off. L.A. Musing asked a great question, Simon. What can we do if we live in a blue state? Guys, there are lots of ways to sign up to make calls into key states. But Simon, if you can answer that question.
If you volunteer for the Harris campaign, you can make calls into the battlegrounds from wherever you live. You can text. And also the House, if you live in California, you've got a bunch of House races that we need to win. There are critical House races in New York and in California and across the country. It's easy to do. One of the reasons we've become so powerful and so strong, and our performance is at the upper end of what's possible in election after election, is millions of proud patriots are going to work from wherever they live and using these new tools that we have, connecting over Zoom, remote phone banking and texting. And even my own organization, Hopium, we now have a Thursday night call and postcarding session for the key House candidates every Thursday night at 7:30. We've had hundreds of people join. So there are so many ways to get involved. And it doesn't matter it no longer matters. It used to be you could only export your money to the battlegrounds. Now you can export your labor. And that's, if we all go to work, the 2 to 3 million of us, the proud patriots who love our country, if we roll up our sleeves and stay focused these next few months, we're going to kick their ass and have the election we all want to have.
Absolutely. Well, folks, once again, thank you so much for joining us on the strategy session. We will see you again next week, and onward to victory, everybody. Have a great night.
Thanks, Simon.
Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Simon.
Take care.